Hey everybody, this is going to be a follow-up to my Sifu art analysis, so if you haven't seen that, I recommend checking that one out first. This video is going to be all about designing a kind of fake level for Sifu and incorporating some of the art things that I talked about in my analysis, and sort of how I did this illustration over here. Anyway, let's get straight into it. The team at Slowclap did an incredible job designing the levels for Sifu. As I mentioned in my art analysis, the entire game followed a framework that was repeated for each level. So there were 5 bosses that corresponded to 5 different wuxing elements, 5 main color palettes, 5 main shapes, and so on and so forth. Something I really love is the amount of variety that's present between all of the levels, and it's clear that each level has its own individual identity and theme. And so when I was thinking about what to paint for this demo, I got this comment here by Sphinx. He said I should kind of do my own take on the wuxing idea, which I actually really liked. I thought this was a really good place to start, so I started brainstorming about what a fake DLC level could look like in Sifu. I do know we got the arena pack, which has a whole bunch of new environments here, but I wanted something a little bit more fresh. I started browsing different locations in China, and I found this really awesome old town of Lightyears, which has all of these really cool olden buildings and a river running throughout it. When thinking about the different elements of wuxing, I wanted to try something with wind. So even though this isn't an actual element of wuxing, I still thought this could kind of fit thematically. Okay, now for the actual level itself, the idea that I had was that you're going after a former student of your own martial arts school. So in my headcanon, this kind of takes place after you defeat Yang, and the main character has opened up their own martial arts school. At some point, they get betrayed, and then now we're on another quest of revenge. So it's kind of like also how Yang betrayed our father, but in a reversed kind of way. So one of our former students, you know, it's kind of like Luke Skywalker and Ben Solo, that kind of feeling. Also in my fake level, it takes place in Lightyears, and another idea I had was that it would start off very sunny as you played in the level, but then gradually turn cloudy and eventually become a full-on hurricane when you're fighting the boss. And maybe they use like wind powers and stuff to knock you off balance and things like that. So from there, I had this kind of framework that I wanted to explore, and I hopped into PureRef to gather all of my different references. I find this is really an important part when you start your own illustrations because it informs you about the different kinds of things you're going to be painting. Gathering references is super important because it helps to see all of your ideas in front of you. Especially because we're creating an original illustration, I need to know the things like what the shops in Lightyears look like, the kinds of materials that they use in the buildings, but also other things like Sifu's concept art to make sure I'm actually staying close to the visual style. And even by the end here, you can just see how many references I ended up having. I will admit, sometimes you can go a little too far with it, so try to keep things focused, unlike me. It can be very easy to keep gathering references instead of focusing on painting, and so at some point you just gotta take the plunge and get to work. For my actual illustration itself, it's not exactly concept art because I'm not detailing anything in the environment, but it's more of just a finalized keyframe illustration, something I suppose that you would either provide for marketing or give to an animator or people that want to design the level further, more of a proof of concept, but it's also a lot more polished. So I also wanted my illustration to capture a moment at the beginning of the level where Yin is fighting some easier enemies. And as always, I start off with a very simple line sketch. As far as the actual subject matter itself goes, I wanted Yin to be kicking a dude right in the face and knocking them into the river, which also kind of demonstrates the environment damage you can do in this level. I also wanted the gang to be kind of an homage to the Axe Gang in Kung Fu Hustle, because something I've noticed in Sifu is that Slowclap are huge fans of the Kung Fu film genre, and they put tons of little Easter eggs throughout. So this is kind of an extension of that. So you can actually see here, this is the loose sketch that I drew on a piece of paper with a pen, and while it's not super detailed, it has enough information for me to continue and take this into Photoshop to detail it further. After I was pretty confident with the general composition, I then added some perspective grids in Photoshop and started to refine my sketch a little bit more. For the actual resolution of the image, I decided to make it 4K just so that you can have it as a wallpaper, but I did also want to eventually have this as a print, and so I have this A5 sheet over here, just kind of having the most important elements inside. And I knew that I really wanted this image feeling dynamic, so I went with a 3-point perspective grid to make sure the vertical lines were feeling nice and flowy. From there, I started blocking in a very basic valley structure, thinking mainly about where the light is falling. So a value structure is the image itself just in a couple of different tones, black and white essentially, and you really think about where the shadows fall, and it's thinking about the overall read of the image. So that also just means that making focal points clear, making buildings look like buildings, and having the general spread of light versus dark in the image too. Since yin kicking the enemy here is the main focal point, I wanted to reserve some sunlight here so I could play around with the shadows and bring focus to them. You'll notice that I only use 3 tones in this rough thumbnail, and the reason why is to keep things as simple as possible. I have one value here for my midtones, one for my lights, and then another one for my darks. And that's really all the info that you need at this stage. Once that was done, I started color blocking. So it's hard to know what colors to choose at the beginning of an illustration, but I also wanted to keep things nice and focused. As each level in Sifu has a main color in its design, I decided that for this fake level, red and grey would be my main choices for this, with small hints of green throughout. To be honest, this was already kind of decided for me in my references. So looking at the real world examples of Lightyears, there's a lot of greys and reds, and the plants here have that hint of green. So I wanted to kind of use that and not completely reinvent the wheel. The grey also gave me an opportunity to really make the sky feel like it's rainy and sunny at the same time. It's got this really nice kind of dynamic that I wanted to capture in the lighting for this illustration. When I'm also blocking in colors, I'm purposely staying zoomed out as much as possible to fill the canvas with large paint strokes. It's kind of like playing with clay at this point, and it's done to avoid the temptation to start detailing anything. The main focus of this early section, after I've done my values, is to simply lay down the colors and not worry about textures or details. And kind of like clay, you have to refine what's already there the more you progress in an illustration, but you can't really sculpt from nothing. You need that foundation first. To be honest, this is something I constantly need to remind myself with digital art, because it's so easy to zoom in and start using fancy brushes, but what it does is waste time and effort. Once I felt fairly happy with things, I then started detailing them and looking at my references to figure out what I needed to add. And at the beginning stages, once I've finished blocking in the colors, things are actually fairly abstract, so the more I zoom in, it's kind of just paint splotches everywhere. There's suggestions of light and dark here, but I'm going to actually start detailing them. So that includes things like making the textures look like concrete, making water look like water. I'm starting to detail some of the windows and get the architectural elements in as well. This is something I actually find really fun in the whole process, and that's creating nice juicy textures. They don't actually have to be very descriptive to get the job done. Something I've noticed a lot in Sifu's concept art is this really nice interesting shape here, which looks like just a bunch of small colored circles moving in a direction. This is more of a style thing than slow clap uses, and a cool way to do it in Photoshop is like this. So what I'm going to do here is choose the default round brush and then press F5 to bring up the brush menu. I'm going to go into this menu over here, and where it says spacing, I'm going to click and drag it just a little bit here. I don't want to see the individual circles, but I do want to break up that shape just a tad. After that's done, I'm going to move into color dynamics and check these couple of boxes here. Now when I click and drag in Photoshop, you'll see that it starts to create that really nice awesome shape. You can play around with the spacing to increase it more or less and kind of have it how you want it. But once it's done, I'll actually go ahead and draw a line here on a separate layer and then merge it back in, and that's kind of how I achieve this effect. You can really do this with any other texture as well, so if you have things such as concrete brushes or interesting shapes, you can kind of draw it flat first in Photoshop and then warp it into perspective to make that feeling of depth. So after detailing this illustration, I think I was about 15 hours or so into it when I got to this stage here. So you can see I've detailed most of the background. I've also drawn a couple of the enemies in the back here. I've got a couple of bits of signage around the place and a pretty good sense of lighting. But I had just started to detail our main characters. And I'm going to be honest, something at this point just wasn't working for me in this image. I felt like the value read that I had at the start wasn't as strong as I wanted, and I asked for some feedback from my friends. Especially the main character here, it felt kind of lost, and the more that I painted, the more I realized I was kind of just wasting time. I knew that I was stuck when I was just kind of detailing a bush, detailing a tree, and it wasn't really going anywhere. So I decided to ask a couple of my friends for some feedback. I ended up getting some really great advice from a few friends, and one thing that I heard from all of them was that the values could definitely be improved to make the characters more of a focal point. So at the moment, the main character here is kind of getting lost in the background, and even though I tried to have kind of a highlight section on the left-hand side here, it really isn't as reading as strongly as it could. At the moment, the image also feels pretty detailed everywhere, and while there is a light direction, if you zoom out and look at the illustration as a whole, it's really hard to tell what's going on. This is a big sign that your illustration just isn't working. And I just wanted to put emphasis on, even though I did do value thumbnails at the start, as I started to get into the rhythm of painting and have the actual image unfold in front of me, it just wasn't working. Something wasn't really feeling right along the way. Another important piece of feedback that I got was the perspective could feel a little bit more dynamic by lowering the camera angle and also just improving the overall poses for my characters. At this stage, I'm not gonna lie, I sat down and I really thought about my next moves. And because when I started this illustration, I really wanted it to push me as an artist, I knew that I could do better than what I had, even though it would kind of suck because I would have to throw away a lot of time. I ultimately decided that it's something that I needed to make the image more successful overall. So, with that being said, I decided to completely restart. It's also part of the reason why this video took so long, because I really wanted to deliver and give you guys something quality that you could learn from. And now, I'm not gonna lie, it's really hard killing your darlings, but I knew that it was gonna make for a stronger illustration with my new feedback. To save a bit of time, instead of starting completely from scratch, I actually decided to restart and model the scene in Blender. I used a bunch of very simple gray boxes and simple shapes here, and then I downloaded a free 3D model of a human character and kind of posed them the way that I wanted. When I set up my camera, I also added a couple of dynamic lights and a dynamic sky, and then rendered things out and was finally left with this. Even though it's in a very, very rough state here, I knew that this was already a stronger read visually, and the poses also felt way more dynamic and full of energy. So, because I had also put so much work into my previous version, I decided to photo bash it back into the foundations of this one. And this is what it looks like. I know it looks absolutely ridiculous here, but I was still able to use things like the river, the henchman in the back, and some of the bushes. I simply just cut these out of my illustration and pasted them into my new Photoshop document. I also liked my overall color palette, and so I would actually cut and paste them into the new document here and color pick straight from them and then continue painting. To avoid making the same mistake that I did in my first iteration, I decided to start detailing my characters first and foremost. I had enough information of what the rest of the lighting was going to look like, and therefore knew how the lighting was going to look on our characters. Once again, I want to stress the importance of value when you paint. So again, just meaning how light things are and how dark things are. Colors are not actually that important when you paint. Sure, they do help in eliciting some kind of emotion from our viewers, but the value structure underneath must be the thing that holds up properly. The main choice that I made, and the main difference that I made here, is that now there's the most amount of contrast between our characters. So the guy that's getting kicked in the face is surrounded by the sky, which was very important. It meant that it brought a lot of contrast to his silhouette. But then also with the main character Yin, I made sure that the background here was still going to be fairly light in a mid-tone, so that the dark darks and the light lights of the character would show up and be strong. With this also in mind, I made sure that each color choice I had from this point stayed within the value structure. So if I convert this image to black and white, you'll see what I mean. When I'm going to detail and render everything, the colors that I'm choosing must not exceed what I've set up here. So any shadows that I chose for the light area was not actually going to be that dark, and any of the light areas that I chose for the shadows weren't going to be that light. This maintains the value structure that you have and reinforces the focal point, which I actually found very, very helpful. And if I just convert the image into black and white and kind of skip through here and show you the different iterations, you'll see that I stayed very strict from the value setup that I now had. So once this was all done, everything was pretty straightforward from this point. So the final touches in the illustration were things such as, giving the gangsters some tattoos, thinking about different props I could add, a couple of pots here and there, adding glasses flying off his face because that constantly happens in game, but also adding a couple of wind effects with some leaves moving throughout the image. So it's again me looking back at my references, having a look at what the old buildings look like in Lightyears, and then thinking about how I could add that back into my illustration. From here, it was just a matter of time of putting my headphones in and getting to work and painting. If you are curious for how I did things like the brick buildings or the textures or any of the background elements here, I'm going to link a building tutorial I made for it right here. Overall, when looking back at this illustration, I'm actually super glad that I decided to restart, even though it felt like a major setback at the time. The truth is, the first version I did is the direct reason the second became much more successful. Now, when I zoom out between both, it's much clearer what's happening in the second and feels a lot more dynamic. From the very first line sketch to the final illustration, this entire project took me about 34 hours to complete, according to my OBS recordings. To me, this does feel a little bit too long for a digital illustration, and I do want to improve my speed in getting these things done, but the main thing first and foremost for me to focus on was actually trying to improve. So my advice is, if you are taking a really big illustration that's pushing you out of your own comfort zone to definitely keep in mind of how long it take you. It's just good to know these things in general so you have that future information, but really focus and take your time and don't rush. It's much more important to learn something than it necessarily is to get a deadline out if you don't really have a deadline, for example. And I can confidently say that I definitely learned a ton in this illustration too. If you are curious, I'm also going to put up the full Photoshop file of both of the illustrations together, as well as the blend file on my Gumroad, and if you want to support the channel, I'd really appreciate you checking it out. But I'm curious as to what you think. Do you think this is something that could be a level in Sifu? Do you think we're actually going to get any DLC for Sifu? Do you think there's going to be a sequel to Sifu? That would actually be pretty awesome. Also, I did watch Secret Level that just came out, and the art style, as expected, was gorgeous, though the episode was way too short. I wanted so much more from that. So hopefully this either gets picked up into a series or they do more with it as well, because I just find that, as you may not be able to tell, I'm a pretty big fan of Sifu, and I just want to see this game and the team shine at Slow Clap and definitely get more praise, and I'm really glad that Secret Level is able to do that for them. So anyway, I'm curious of all of your thoughts of everything. Let me know down in the comments below. I really appreciate you watching this one. I hope you learned something, and until next time, take care and stay safe.